Sometimes the smallest act of mercy can change everything. When 58-year-old widower Hank Mercer pulled a dying donkey from a cold river, he thought he was just saving one lost creature. But what happened next defied everything he understood about animals and the land he'd lived on all his life. A whole herd of wild burros appeared at his cabin, watching him, waiting. They began leading him into the desert hills toward a place he'd tried to forget for 40 years. His grandfather's abandoned mining shack held secrets about his family that would force Hank to confront the pain he'd carried since childhood. Could a herd of wild donkeys somehow know what one grieving man needed to find peace? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like every other morning had for the past 3 years. Hank Mercer woke before sunrise. In his small cabin along the Verde River, made coffee in the same dented pot he'd used since Sarah died, and stood on the porch watching the sky turn from deep purple to orange. The desert stretched out before him in every direction, silent except for the occasional call of a canyon wren or the rustle of cottonwood leaves in the pre-dawn breeze. He was 58 years old, though some days he felt twice that. His hands were weathered from decades of outdoor work, his face lined with the kind of creases that came from squinting into the sun and smiling less than he used to. His hair had gone mostly grey, cut short because Sarah wasn't there anymore to tell him when it needed trimming. The cabin sat on 12 acres of scrubland, bordered by the river on one side and Bureau of Land Management territory on the other 3. It wasn't much to look at: rough pine boards, a tin roof that pinged when it rained, 2 rooms and a loft that Hank never used anymore, but it had been theirs, his and Sarah's, and he couldn't bring himself to leave it, even though every corner held memories that sometimes felt like they were pressing down on his chest. He'd been a trail guide for 32 years before retiring, leading city folks on horseback through the backcountry, teaching them to read the land, pointing out desert bighorn sheep on distant ridges, and explaining which plants the Apache had used for medicine. Sarah had worked the business side, booking clients and managing supplies from their home office. They'd made a good life together, simple but rich in the ways that mattered. Then, 3 years ago, on a Tuesday morning in October, she'd complained of feeling tired. By Friday, she was in the hospital. By the following Tuesday, she was gone. Pancreatic cancer, the doctor said. Nothing they could do. It moved too fast. Hank hadn't guided a trail since. He lived off their savings and his modest retirement, kept to himself, and tried not to think too much about the decades ahead that suddenly seemed longer and emptier than the desert itself. He kept a small barn behind the cabin where he'd once housed the horses they'd used for trail rides. Now it held only 2 aging mares named Bess and Clementine, plus whatever injured or abandoned animal he occasionally came across. He had a soft spot for creatures in trouble, always had. Sarah used to tease him about it, said he'd bring home every lost thing in Arizona if she'd let him. On the porch railing sat a leather journal, its cover cracked and faded from sun exposure. Sarah's journal. She'd been an artist in her spare time, filling page after page with sketches of the wildlife they'd encountered: roadrunners, javelinas, coyotes, and especially the wild burros that roamed the BLM lands. She'd loved those burros, said they had personality and dignity, despite being dismissed by most ranchers as nuisances. Hank picked up the journal now, as he did most mornings, and flipped through the pages. Her handwriting accompanied many of the sketches, observations about behavior, little jokes, reminders to herself. On one page, she'd drawn a mother burro with her foal and written, "They remember kindness. They remember everything." He closed the journal gently and set it back down. The sun was fully up now, and he had work to do. The vegetable garden needed watering, the chicken coop needed cleaning, and he'd promised himself he'd finally fix the fence post that had been leaning since last winter. Small tasks, but they gave structure to days that might otherwise drift by without purpose. He was halfway to the garden when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong, a thrashing in the water, desperate and rhythmic. Hank stopped, listening. The river ran about 50 yards from his back door, usually peaceful this time of year, but something was struggling out there, and struggling hard. He set down his water bucket and walked quickly toward the sound. The river bank sloped down through willow, saplings and tamarisk, and as he pushed through the brush, he saw it. A donkey, dark grey and emaciated, caught in a tangle of driftwood in the shallow current. The animal's head kept going under, then surfacing with a desperate gasp. It was exhausted, nearly finished. Hank didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots and waded in. The water was cold, snowmelt, still feeding down from higher elevations. The donkey's eyes were rolling white with panic as Hank reached it, but the animal was too weak to fight, much as he began working to free its legs from the twisted branches. It took 10 minutes of careful maneuvering, the current pulling at his legs while he worked. When the last branch came loose, the donkey tried to stand, but couldn't. Hank got behind it, placed both hands under its chest, and with a grunt of effort, half carried, half dragged the creature toward the bank. They collapsed together on dry land, both breathing hard. The donkey lay on its side, ribs showing starkly through. Its hide. There was an old rope halter around its head, frayed and embedded in the skin. In places this had been someone's animal once, now abandoned or lost. Hank sat catching his breath, water streaming off his clothes. He looked at the donkey's face, at its long ears, and the intelligent eyes that seemed to hold something like gratitude mixed with exhaustion. "Well," he said quietly, "I guess you're coming home with me." It took another hour to get the donkey to the barn. He couldn't lift it, so he'd gone back for Bess, his gentlest mare, and rigged a makeshift travois using a tarp and 2 poles. The donkey lay quiet during the slow journey, as if understanding that help had finally arrived. In the barn, Hank set up a stall with fresh straw and filled a bucket with water. The donkey drank a little, then rested its head down with a deep sigh. He examined it more carefully now. A jack, probably 8 or 9 years old, hooves overgrown and cracked, multiple scars across its shoulders and flanks. This animal had been through hardship. Hank cleaned the embedded halter wounds with warm water and antiseptic, talking softly the whole time. The donkey barely flinched. When he was done, he covered the animal with an old blanket and stood back, hands on his hips. "Need a name, I suppose," he said. "Can't just call you Donkey. How about River? Since that's where I found you." The donkey's ear swiveled toward him. "River it is." He spent the rest of the day checking on River every hour, offering food and water, monitoring for signs of distress. By evening, the donkey was able to stand, though shakily. It was a good sign. Tough creatures, donkeys, survivors. That night, Hank sat on his porch as usual, watching the stars emerge. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a small sense of purpose beyond just existing. River needed care, needed time to recover. It gave Hank a reason to get up tomorrow beyond watering vegetables and fixing fence posts. He thought about Sarah's words in her journal. They remember kindness. Maybe so. Maybe this one would remember. What Hank didn't know, couldn't know, was that River did remember. And so did others. River recovered faster than Hank expected. Within 3 days, the donkey was walking the perimeter of his stall with steady steps, and within a week he was nickering impatiently whenever Hank appeared with food. The wounds from the embedded halter were healing clean, and with regular meals, the worst of the emaciation was already less pronounced. Donkeys were resilient, Hank knew, but River seemed particularly determined to live. On the 8th morning after the rescue, Hank was in the barn, applying salve to River's healing wounds, when the donkey's head suddenly lifted, ears swiveling forward with intense focus. A moment later, River released a loud bray, not the sound of distress, but something else, a call. And from somewhere outside, an answer came back. Hank straightened, frowning. He wasn't expecting any visitors, and the nearest neighbor was Dutch Patterson, who lived 3 miles south and usually announced himself by truck horn before arriving. This sound had been another donkey. He stepped out of the barn into the cool morning light and stopped dead. 7 wild burros stood in a loose semicircle about 30 yards from the barn. They were still as statues, all facing his direction. 3 Jacks and 4 Jennies, their coats ranging from dark grey to dusty brown. They weren't grazing or milling about. They were simply standing there, watching. Hank had seen wild burros plenty of times in his years in the desert. They were common enough on BLM land, descendants of mining-era pack animals that had gone feral over generations. But he'd never seen them behave like this, so deliberate, so focused. Wild burros typically kept their distance from human habitation, wary from years of harassment by ranchers who viewed them as competition for cattle. Grazing. He walked slowly toward them, expecting them to bolt. They didn't. The closest one, a large grey jack with a distinctive white blaze on his face, took a single step forward, ears pricked, then stopped again. Watching. "Well, hello there," Hank said softly. "You folks looking for your friend?" Behind him, River brayed again from inside the barn. The grey jack answered, a deep, resonant call that echoed off the canyon walls. Then the others joined in, a chorus that seemed less like random donkey noise and more like communication. Hank stood in the middle of his yard, halfway between the barn and the wild herd, feeling something like he'd stumbled into a moment he didn't fully understand. The burros weren't threatening. They weren't begging for food. They were simply there, present in a way that felt intentional. After several long minutes, the herd turned as one and walked away, not hurrying, moving back toward the open desert. The grey jack looked back once before, disappearing over a rise. Hank returned to the barn, where River was pacing his stall, still calling. "Friends of yours?" Hank asked. The donkey pushed his nose against Hank's chest, something he'd started doing in recent days. A sign of trust, or maybe affection. "They seemed pretty interested in you," Hank continued, scratching River's ears. "Can't say I blame them. You're decent company." That evening, Dutch Patterson did show up, his ancient Ford pickup rattling into the yard just as Hank was closing up the barn. Dutch was 72, thin as a fence post, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been running cattle on the land adjacent to Hank's property for 40 years, and was one of the few people Hank still tolerated. "Heard you pulled a donkey out of the river," Dutch said by way of greeting, climbing out of his truck with the stiffness of old bones. "News travels," Hank replied. "It's a small valley." Dutch walked to the barn and peered at River, who regarded him calmly from the stall. "That's a good-looking animal. Somebody's loss. Somebody's abandonment. More like—" Halter was grown into his neck. Dutch made a disapproving sound. "People. No sense and less heart." He turned to Hank. "You planning to keep him?" "Haven't thought that far ahead. He needed help. I gave it." "Fair enough." Dutch leaned against the stall door. "You see any others around?" "Why do you ask?" "Because I saw a whole passel of wild burros moving through my section this morning, 7 or 8 of them, heading north, toward your place. They were here," Hank confirmed, "standing in my yard like they were waiting for something." Dutch's eyebrows rose. "That's unusual." "That's what I thought." "Burros are smart," Dutch said. "Smarter than horses, some say. They remember things. Remember places. Remember people." He paused. "Remember debts." Hank looked at him. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just something my grandfather used to. Tell me. The old-timers who worked the mines, they had stories about burros, how they'd find water when men couldn't, how they'd lead lost miners back to camp, how they'd stand vigil over a fallen companion." Dutch shrugged. "Course. Those were work animals, not wild ones. But the instinct's the same." "You're saying they came to check on River?" "I'm saying animals know more than we give them credit for." Dutch headed back to his truck. "Keep your eyes open, Hank. If that herd keeps coming around, they might be trying to tell you something." After Dutch left, Hank sat on his porch steps, watching the last light fade from the western sky. The desert evening was coming alive with small sounds, crickets, a distant coyote, the wind moving through the mesquite. He found himself thinking about what Dutch had said, about burros and memory. Sarah would have loved this. She'd have already been sketching them in her journal, adding observations about their behavior. She'd always insisted, Animals had more going on inside than most people realized. The next morning, the herd was back. This time they were closer, just beyond the fence line of Hank's property. The grey Jack with the white blaze stood at the front, and as Hank emerged from the cabin with his coffee, the animal took several deliberate steps forward, not approaching directly, but angling toward the northeast, toward the desert hills that rose in the distance. The Jack stopped, looked back at Hank, then took a few more steps in the same direction, stopped again, looked back. Hank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. The animal was leading, or trying to. River brayed from the barn, loud and insistent. When Hank went to check on him, the donkey was pacing, clearly agitated. He brayed again, then moved to the stall door, pushing against it. "Easy, boy. You're not strong enough yet for a walk." But River didn't calm down. He kept pushing, kept calling, his attention fixed on the direction where the wild herd waited. Hank stood in the barn doorway, looking out at the 7 burros, standing patient as sentinels, then back at River. Something was happening here, something beyond his understanding. The practical part of his mind said it was just coincidence, just animals being animals. But another part, the part that had spent decades reading the desert, trusting his instincts about weather and water and the subtle signs that kept people alive in hard country, that part said to pay attention. The grey Jack took a few more steps northeast, stopped, looked back. Hank went inside his cabin and found the item he hadn't looked at in weeks, a worn brass compass that had been in River's saddlebag. He'd cleaned the bag when he'd removed the halter, finding the compass along with some dried-out leather ties and nothing else. The compass was old but functional, its brass case engraved with initials he couldn't quite make out through the tarnish. He flipped it open. The needle swung, settled, pointing northeast, toward the hills, toward the land where, 40 years ago, his grandfather Thomas Mercer had worked a small mining claim before vanishing from Hank's life forever. Hank told himself he was being foolish. Following a herd of wild burros into the desert based on some vague feeling was exactly the kind of irrational decision that got people hurt or lost. He'd spent his career as a trail guide, preaching preparation and caution, and here he was considering riding out into rough country on the hunch that these animals had something to show him. But the hunch wouldn't leave him alone. For 2 days the herd appeared each morning, always standing in the same patient formation, always oriented northeast. And for 2 days, River grew increasingly restless. His recovery now complete enough that keeping him stalled felt more like cruelty than caution. On the 3rd morning, Hank made his decision. He saddled Bess, his most reliable mare, packed saddlebags with water and basic supplies, and led River out of the barn on a lead rope. The donkey immediately pulled toward the waiting herd, nearly dragging Hank off his feet. All right, Hank muttered. "I hear you." The wild burros watched as he mounted Bess. The moment he did, they turned as one and began walking northeast at a steady pace. River fell in beside Bess without hesitation, and Hank found himself following a herd of wild animals into country he hadn't visited in decades. The terrain rose gradually from the river valley, moving through mesquite and creosote scrub toward the broken hills. Hank knew this area, or had known it once. As a boy, he'd ridden out here with his grandfather during summer visits, back when Thomas Mercer still worked his claim in the hills. Those had been good days, before everything changed. The memory came back clearly now, as Bess picked her way up the rocky trail, himself, at 11 years old, sitting behind his grandfather on a big roan gelding, the old man pointing out ore formations and explaining how to read the rock. Thomas had been a hard man in some ways, weathered by years of physical labor and desert living, but he'd been patient with Hank, teaching him about the land with genuine care. Then, the summer Hank turned 12, Thomas left, just packed up one day and disappeared. No explanation, no goodbye. Hank's father, Thomas's son, never spoke about it except in bitter fragments. "Selfish old bastard," he'd say, cared more about that damn claim than his own family. The bitterness infected everything. Hank's father drank more, worked less, and died of a heart attack at 53. Hank's mother had long since divorced him. The family fractured and scattered, and Hank was left with questions he'd learned not to ask. Now, at 58, Hank realized he'd never actually dealt with that pain. He'd just buried it, the way men of his father's generation and his own had been taught to bury difficult feelings. Work through it, don't dwell, move on. Except you never really moved on, did you? You just carried it with you, a weight you got so used to you forgot it was there. The herd moved with purpose, not hurrying but not hesitating either. The grey Jack led, and the others maintained formation like an escort. River walked alongside Bess with his ears forward, alert and engaged in a way Hank had never seen from a domestic animal. By midday, they'd covered perhaps 6 miles. The hills had grown steeper, the vegetation sparser. This was the edge of real desert country, where summer temperatures could kill an unprepared traveler, and water was scarce enough that knowing where to find it meant the difference between life and death. Hank called a stop in the shade of an overhanging rock formation. He dismounted, gave Bess water from a collapsible bucket, and River drank from the same bucket without hesitation. The wild herd had stopped about 50 yards ahead, waiting. As Hank stood there, letting Bess rest, he noticed something he'd missed in the morning's rush to follow the herd. Small rock cairns dotted the trail at irregular intervals, stacks of 3 or 4 stones balanced on top of each other. They were weathered, clearly old, but deliberate. Trail markers. His grandfather's trail markers. Thomas had taught him about these. You mark a trail, the old man had said, so you can always find your way back, and so anyone who comes after you knows they're going the right way. Hank bent down and examined the nearest cairn. The rocks were desert-varnished, dark with age. These had been here for decades, 40 years maybe. He straightened slowly, a strange feeling settling over him. Was this coincidence? Or had the burros somehow known these markers would lead to something Hank needed to see? The faded photograph was in his saddlebag. He'd grabbed it on impulse before leaving. He pulled it out now, looking at the image he'd avoided for years. Himself at 10, standing next to Thomas in front of the mining shack, both of them squinting into the sun, both smiling, happy. God, he'd been happy then. Before the abandonment, before the bitterness, before learning that people you loved could just disappear without explanation. Come on, boy, he said to River, tucking the photo away. Let's see where they're taking us. The afternoon's journey took them deeper into the hills. The trail grew rougher, winding between boulder fields and across dry washes. Twice, Hank had to dismount and lead Bess through particularly tricky sections. River navigated them with the sure-footedness of an animal born to this terrain. They camped that night in a small box canyon where a seep provided enough water for the horses and donkey. The wild herd settled about 100 yards away, forming a loose circle. Hank built a small fire, made coffee, and ate a simple dinner of jerky and hardtack. River stood close by, occasionally making soft sounds, not distressed, just present. As darkness fell and the stars emerged in their thousands, Hank found himself talking to the donkey the way he might have talked to Sarah. I don't know what we're doing out here, he said. Following a bunch of wild burros, to God knows where, based on nothing but a feeling. He paused. You think they really know something? Or am I just a lonely old man looking for meaning where there isn't any? River's ears swiveled toward him. Attentive, Sarah would say, to trust it. She always believed in things I couldn't see or measure. Intuition, she called it. Said some truths couldn't be proved, only felt. He sipped his coffee. I miss that about her. She made room for mystery. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the darkness, a nighthawk called. I was angry at my grandfather for a long time, Hank continued. Still am, if I'm honest. He taught me about this land, made me love it, then just disappeared. Never came back. Never explained. He shook his head. My father said he was selfish. Maybe he was, but I keep thinking about those trail markers. Why would a selfish man take the time to mark a trail? Who was he marking it for? River moved closer, resting his head against Hank's shoulder. The gesture was so gentle, so trusting, that Hank felt something break open in his chest, some calcified place he'd kept locked for decades. "Thanks for listening," he said quietly, scratching the donkey's ears. "You're good company." That night, Hank dreamed of his grandfather. Thomas was standing at the entrance to a mine shaft, holding a lantern, beckoning. "Come on, boy," he said in the dream. "I've got something to show you." But when Hank tried to follow, the entrance disappeared, and he was alone in the desert with the wind picking up, calling his name in his grandfather's voice. He woke at dawn, unsettled but determined. The wild herd was already moving. By mid-morning of the second day, the landscape had changed again. They'd climbed into higher desert, where juniper and pinyon pine dotted the slopes. The air was cooler here, thinner. And ahead, barely visible against the hillside, Hank could see the dark opening of a mine shaft, and beside it, the weathered remains of a wooden structure, his grandfather's claim. The burros stopped at a respectful distance, forming their semicircle formation again. The grey Jack looked at Hank, then toward the mine, then back to Hank. The message was clear. "This is what we brought you to see." Hank dismounted slowly, his heart hammering. He'd sworn he'd never come back here. After Thomas left, after his father's bitterness poisoned any good memories, this place had become associated with abandonment and loss. He'd actively avoided this section of the hills for his entire adult life. But here he was, standing in front of the collapsed remains of his grandfather's dreams, with a rescued donkey and a herd of wild burros as witnesses. River pushed against his leg, gentle encouragement. "All right," Hank said. "Let's see what's here." The morning sun was climbing higher as Hank approached his grandfather's old camp, and with each step, fragments of memory surfaced like fish rising to the surface of still water. The layout was exactly as he remembered, the mine entrance to the left, dug into the hillside and now partially collapsed. The wooden shack to the right, its walls weathered silver grey, the roof sagging but still mostly intact. Between them, what had once been a working area, now reclaimed by desert scrub. He tied Bess to a stunted juniper and walked forward slowly, River following close behind. The wild herd remained where they'd stopped, watching with that same patient intensity they'd shown since the beginning. The shack's door hung crooked on one leather hinge. Hank pushed it open carefully, and it swung inward with a groan. Sunlight fell through gaps in the roof, illuminating the interior in dusty shafts. The space was small, maybe 12 feet. Square, with a rusted iron stove in one corner, a collapsed bunk against the back wall, and a rough wooden table still standing near the door. On the table, covered in 40 years of dust and debris, sat a silver mining pick head. Hank's breath caught. He moved closer, brushing away the accumulated dirt with gentle fingers. The pick was well made, the kind a serious miner would have invested in, and there, engraved on the flat side of the head, were initials T. M. Thomas Mercer. Hank picked it up, feeling the weight of it in his hands. The handle had long since rotted away, but the head was solid, the steel still sound despite the rust. His grandfather had used this, swung it thousands of times against stubborn rock, hoping to find the vein that would change everything. "Why did you leave?" Hank asked the empty room. His voice sounded strange after the long silence. "What was so important that you couldn't even say goodbye?" The shack held no answers, just the accumulated silence of decades. But as Hank looked around more carefully, he noticed other things. A leather tool belt hung from a nail, the tools still in their loops. A pair of worn boots stood by the door, as if Thomas had just stepped out and might return at any moment. And on a shelf he hadn't noticed at first, a row of small objects, a pocket watch, a tobacco tin, a bone-handled knife, things a man wouldn't leave behind if he'd chosen to go. The realization came slowly, like dawn light filling a valley. These weren't the belongings of someone who'd abandoned his claim and his family. This was the camp of someone who'd intended to come back. Hank stepped outside, his mind racing. River stood waiting, and beyond him, the wild herd remained in formation. The grey Jack took a few steps forward, then angled toward the mine entrance. "You want me to look in there?" Hank asked. The jack didn't move, just stood watching. The mine entrance was partially blocked by fallen rock and timber, but a gap remained large enough to squeeze through if someone wanted to badly enough. Hank had exploring mines on his list of terrible ideas, right up there with swimming in flash floods and trying to pet rattlesnakes. Old mines were death traps, unstable and dangerous, but something pulled him forward anyway. He returned to Bess and retrieved his battery lantern from the saddlebags, then approached the mine entrance. The air coming from the opening was cool and smelled of minerals and thyme. He clicked on the lantern and shone it through the gap. The passage extended back into the hillside, rough-hewn walls showing pick marks. About 15 feet in, the passage opened into a small chamber, probably where Thomas had been working the vein. And there, visible in the lantern light, something reflected. Hank squeezed through the gap, moving carefully. The rock underfoot was stable enough, and the timber supports, while aged, seemed to have held. He moved into the chamber and raised his lantern. What he saw made him stop breathing. The chamber walls were covered in writing, words carved directly into the rock face, hundreds of them, covering every available surface. And in the center of the chamber, a wooden crate sat undisturbed, its lid closed. Hank moved closer to the nearest wall and began to read. The 14th of April, 1985, found a good vein today. Might be the one. Thinking of Hank and what this could mean for his future. A stake for him, something to build on. The boys got promise. He moved to another section. The 2nd of May, 1985. Vein is getting richer. If this continues, could be significant. Dreaming of what I could do for the family. College for Hank. A real business for my son. A chance to make up for lost time. Another section, the letters carved with what must have been tremendous effort. The 10th of June, 1985. My son came by yesterday. We argued again. He says I'm wasting my life out here. Maybe he's right. But I'm so close. I can feel it. Just a little more time. And I can prove to him, to all of them, that I'm not the failure he thinks I am. That I can provide something lasting. Hank's hands were shaking as he read. These weren't the words of a man planning to abandon his family. These were the words of someone trying desperately to give them something better. He found another entry, the carving less careful, as if made in haste or distress. The 22nd of July, 1985. Took a fall today. Hit my head hard. Vision going strange. Probably should ride back to town, get checked by the doc. But if I stop now, lose momentum, might lose the claim. Just a few more days. Need to finish this section. The final entry was near the back of the chamber, the letters uneven. July 25. Worst today. Can't see right. Hands shaking. Should have gone back when I had the chance. Hank, if you ever find this, know that everything I did was for you, for your father, for the family. I wanted to give you something solid, something that couldn't be taken away. I'm sorry I waited too long. I'm sorry I was too proud to ask for help. The claim papers are in the box. It's yours now. Make something good of it. Tell your father I wasn't running away. I was running towards something better for all of you. I love you, boy. I'm sorry. Hank sank to his knees on the stone floor. For 40 years, he'd carried the weight of abandonment, the certainty that his grandfather had valued his mining dream more than his family. But Thomas hadn't left. He'd died here, alone, trying to build something for the people he loved. The tears came then, hot and unexpected. Not just grief for his grandfather, but grief for all the wasted years of anger and bitterness. For his father, who died never knowing the truth. For the family that had fractured under the weight of misunderstanding. River appeared in the mine entrance, silhouetted against the daylight. The donkey made a soft sound, not quite a bray, something gentler. Her presence, steady and patient. After a long time, Hank stood. His knees protested, but he walked to the wooden crate and opened it carefully. Inside were papers, protected from the elements by the sealed box. Mining claim documents in his grandfather's name. A will, leaving everything to my son and grandson. A survey map showing the claim boundaries. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a rock sample. Hank unwrapped it carefully. The stone was laced with silver ore rich enough that even he, no expert, could recognize its value. His grandfather had been right. He'd found his strike, but he'd never lived to file the claim or show anyone what he'd discovered. Hank gathered the papers, secured them in his jacket, and carefully made his way back out of the mine. The sunlight seemed impossibly bright after the darkness. River stood waiting, and beyond him, the wild herd remained in their patient semicircle. The grey Jack stepped forward once more, approaching Hank with a directness he hadn't shown before. The animal stopped, just a few feet away, and lowered his head not in submission, but in what looked like acknowledgement. A gesture of respect, or maybe completion. "You knew," Hank said quietly. "Somehow, you knew what was here, what I needed to find." The Jack held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to the herd. As one, they began moving away, heading back toward the open desert. Their task, whatever it had been, was finished. Only River remained. Hank sat on the ground outside the shack, exhausted and overwhelmed. River settled beside him, close and solid. The afternoon sun was warm on their backs. "He didn't leave us," Hank said aloud. "All these years, all that anger, and he was here the whole time, trying to do right by us." He thought about his father, about the bitterness that had consumed him, the drinking that had killed him. If only they'd known, if only someone had come looking sooner. But there was no changing the past. All Hank could do was carry this truth forward, let it reshape the narrative he'd been living by for decades. He pulled out the faded photograph again himself, and Thomas, both smiling. He could see it differently now, not as a record of what had been lost, but as evidence of what had always been there. Love, care, intention to do good. "I'm sorry I believed the worst of you," Hank said to the image. "I'm sorry we all did." As the afternoon wore on, Hank explored the camp more thoroughly. In the shack, he found other evidence of his grandfather's intentions: sketches for a house design, notes about building a workshop, calculations about what the mine proceeds could fund. Thomas had been planning a future for his family, had been working toward reunion and redemption, not running away. The tragedy of it sat heavy in Hank's chest. But alongside the sadness was something else, a strange kind of relief. The question that had haunted his family for 4 decades finally had an answer, and the answer, while painful, brought a kind of closure. As evening approached, Hank made a decision. He would bury his grandfather, properly this time, with markers and words that honored who the man had actually been. He would file the claim in Thomas's name, see if there was still value in working it. And if there was, he'd use whatever came from it the way Thomas had intended to benefit family, to build something lasting. But first, he needed to rest. The emotional weight of the day had left him drained. He set up camp near the shack, built a fire, and made a simple dinner. River grazed nearby, content and peaceful. As stars emerged overhead, Hank found himself thinking about Dutch's words, about burros and memory, about how they remembered debts, remembered kindness, remembered the people and places that mattered. Had these burros known Thomas? Had they carried packs for him, worked alongside him in the years before his death? Wild burros lived long lives, 20, 30 years sometimes. The grey Jack could have been one of Thomas's animals, or descended from them. Maybe they'd known the old man had died, had somehow understood that his body needed to be found, the truth needed to be revealed. It seemed impossible, and yet here Hank was, sitting beside his grandfather's camp, the truth finally known, because a herd of wild burros had led him here. "Thank you," he said to the darkness, to wherever the herd had gone. "Whatever you are, whatever you knew, thank you." River moved closer, resting his head against Hank's shoulder again. The gesture no longer surprised him. He scratched the donkey's ears, grateful for the company, grateful for the strange chain of events that had brought them both to this moment. "You saved me too," he told River, "not just from drowning, from carrying that anger around forever." The fire burned low. The desert night sang its ancient song of wind and distance and time. And for the first time in years, Hank Mercer felt something like peace beginning to take root in the soil of his grief. The next morning brought clarity about what needed to happen next. Hank couldn't bury his grandfather alone, not properly, not with the respect Thomas deserved. He'd need to bring Dutch, maybe contact the county authorities, do things correctly. But before any of that, he needed to make one thing clear. He walked to the mine entrance and spent an hour carefully marking it with rocks and branches, making it obvious that someone should not enter casually. The structure was unstable, and while it had held for his visit, he wouldn't risk others going in unprepared. Then he returned to the shack and took his time gathering what he thought should be preserved. The silver pick head, the personal items from the shelf, the tool belt, and most importantly, the wooden crate with the claim documents and his grandfather's final message carved into the chamber walls. He'd need to bring a camera back to photograph those words. They were Thomas's true testament, his last attempt to communicate across time and misunderstanding. They deserved to be preserved, shared with what remained of the family. River watched these preparations with patient attention. The donkey seemed to understand that something significant was happening, that this place held meaning beyond the physical. By mid-morning, they were ready to leave. Hank took one last look around the camp, committing it to memory. This place would become something different now, not a symbol of abandonment, but a reminder of good intentions and tragic timing. A reminder that the stories we tell ourselves about people aren't always true, and sometimes it takes 40 years and a herd of wild burros to set the record straight. The journey back took most of the day. Hank moved slowly, his mind processing everything he'd learned. The landscape that had seemed neutral on the way out now felt different, charged with purpose, with connection to family history he'd tried to forget. They reached his cabin just before sunset. Dutch's truck was parked in the yard, and the old rancher was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. "Wondered if you'd make it back tonight," Dutch said, standing slowly. "Was about to head out looking for you tomorrow." Hank dismounted, suddenly exhausted. "I found my grandfather's camp, and I found out what happened to him." Dutch's expression grew serious. "He's there. He never left. Died there, working the claim, trying to make something for his family." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of revelation hanging between them. "I'm going to need help," Hank said finally, "to do right by him, to bring him home properly." Dutch nodded. "I'll make the calls. We'll get it done." That night, Hank sat on his porch with Sarah's journal open in his lap. He read her words about burros and memory, about the intelligence and dignity she'd seen in them. She'd been right, as she so often was. These animals carried something, knowledge, instinct, connection, that humans had largely forgotten or dismissed. River stood in the corral nearby, visible in the light spilling from the cabin windows. The donkey looked content, settled in a way he hadn't been before the journey, as if he too had completed something important. Hank picked up a pen and, for the first time since Sarah's death, wrote in her journal, "Found something today I didn't know I was looking for, the truth about my grandfather." The end of 40 years of misunderstanding. A wild donkey drowning in the river led to all of it. You would have loved this story, Sarah. You would have said, "I told you so," that animals know things we don't, that paying attention to them opens doors we'd otherwise keep closed. You were right, as usual. I miss you. But I think I'm starting to find my way back to living, not just existing. River helped with that. Maybe that's what Grace looks like, a half-drowned donkey in need of rescue who ends up rescuing you instead. He closed the journal and set it aside. Tomorrow would bring official things, authorities, arrangements, the practical business of laying his grandfather to rest with dignity. But tonight, he simply sat with the knowledge that his family's story had been rewritten, that the pain he'd carried had been transformed into something more complex and ultimately more healing. Inside the barn, one of the mares nickered softly. River answered, a sound that carried no distress, only presence. Hank allowed himself a small smile. He'd pulled a dying donkey from a river 2 weeks ago, thinking he was just saving a life. Instead, that donkey had led him to salvation of a different kind, not religious, but deeply spiritual nonetheless. The salvation of truth replacing bitterness, of understanding replacing anger, of connection replacing isolation. The desert night was cool and clear, stars spread overhead in their infinite array. And in the quiet of his cabin, by the Verde River, Hank Mercer began the work of forgiving his grandfather, his father, and maybe most importantly, himself, for all the years spent living in the shadow of a story that had never been true. The following weeks moved with purpose and intention. Dutch proved as good as his word, making the necessary calls to county authorities and helping coordinate the recovery effort. A small team went to Thomas Mercer's mining camp, Hank, Dutch, a deputy sheriff, and the county medical examiner. They found Thomas's remains in the mine chamber, where he'd apparently collapsed after carving his final message. The examiner confirmed what Hank had suspected: severe head trauma, likely from the fall Thomas had mentioned in his carved journal. The injury would have caused confusion, disorientation, and eventually death. Thomas had died trying to complete his work, probably not fully understanding how seriously he'd been hurt. The recovery was handled with respect and care. They photographed the carved messages before carefully extracting the remains. Someone from the Historical Society heard about the find and came to document the site. Apparently, carved mine journals were rare, and Thomas's extensive writing made it historically significant. Hank found a certain irony in that. His grandfather, who'd lived on the margins and died alone, had left behind something scholars wanted to study. The words carved in desperation had become a window into the life and times of small-scale miners in the 1980 seconds, a dying breed even then. The funeral was small, but meaningful. Hank arranged for Thomas to be buried next to Sarah in the cemetery outside town. It seemed right. Somehow two people who'd understood love and loss now resting near each other. Hank's scattered relatives were contacted. A few came, including a cousin he hadn't seen in 20 years. They stood together as Thomas Mercer was finally laid to rest with dignity, 40 years late but no less sincere for the delay. During the service, Hank spoke briefly about what he'd learned, about how his grandfather hadn't abandoned them, but had been working toward their future when tragedy struck, about how 40 years of family bitterness had been based on misunderstanding, and how important it was not to assume the worst of people we love. "He tried to reach us," Hank said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "He just ran out of time. That's the lesson here. Don't wait. Don't assume. Ask questions. Give the people you love the benefit of the doubt. Because stories we tell ourselves aren't always true, and sometimes the truth dies in a mine shaft, waiting to be found." After the service, several people approached him with their own stories of family estrangement and misunderstanding. It seemed his experience had touched something universal, the human tendency to construct narratives that might not match reality, and the damage those false narratives could cause. The mining claim proved to be legitimately valuable. The assayer Hank consulted confirmed that the silver vein was substantial, though extracting it would require significant investment. Hank filed the claim properly in Thomas's name, then, as his legal heir, made arrangements to lease the working rights to a small mining company. The income would be modest, but steady. He set up a fund with the proceeds earmarked for education costs for young people in the county, particularly those interested in geology or mining engineering. It seemed like something Thomas would have wanted, turning his work into opportunity for others, giving young people the kind of stake in the future he'd been trying to provide for Hank. The work of settling his grandfather's affairs kept Hank occupied, but through all of it, River remained a steady presence. The donkey thrived, filling out with regular meals and care until his coat gleamed and his eyes were bright with health and contentment. He'd become gentle and affectionate, seeking out Hank's company, following him around the property like a faithful dog. Dutch commented on it one afternoon when he stopped by to check on Hank's progress with the claim paperwork. "That donkey's devoted to you," he observed, watching River trail behind Hank to the barn. "The feeling's mutual," Hank admitted. "He's good company. Better than most people, if I'm honest. You ever think about what those wild burros knew? How they knew to lead you to that camp? Hank had thought about it extensively. I don't have an explanation that makes sense, but I've stopped needing one. Some things just are. Dutch nodded slowly. My grandfather used to say the land teaches you, if you're willing to learn. Maybe animals are part of that teaching. Maybe so. As autumn arrived and the desert heat began to ease, Hank found himself settling into a new rhythm. The crushing weight of isolation that had defined his life since Sarah's death had lifted, replaced by something more balanced. He still missed her, would always miss her, but the missing had become bearable, no longer threatening to drag him under. He started taking long rides again, River walking alongside Bess as they explored the country Hank had once guided clients through. He found himself noticing things he'd been too numb to see in recent years, the precise blue of the sky, the way light moved across canyon walls, the small, perfect moments of desert life continuing its ancient patterns. One morning, he rode out to check on his grandfather's camp. He'd been maintaining it, making sure the marked mine entrance stayed clearly warned, keeping the shack from collapsing entirely. The Historical Society had expressed interest in possibly preserving it as a site of local interest. As he approached, he saw them, the wild burro herd, grazing peacefully near the camp. The grey Jack with the white blaze raised his head as Hank dismounted, regarding him with what looked like approval. Hank walked slowly toward the herd. They didn't flee. The Jack stepped forward, closing the distance between them until he stood just a few feet from Hank. "Thank you," Hank said quietly. "I never properly thanked you. For knowing what I needed. For leading me here." The Jack held his gaze for a long moment, then stepped forward and touched his nose gently to Hank's chest, the same gesture River had made in the barn all those weeks ago. A gesture of connection, of recognition. Then the herd moved away, walking into the desert with their characteristic deliberate pace. Hank watched them go, understanding that this was goodbye, or maybe just a different kind of hello. These animals would continue their lives in the wild, and he would continue his, but they were all connected now by the strange events that had brought truth to light. River, who'd been standing quietly nearby, moved to Hank's side. The two of them stood together in the desert morning, watching the wild herd disappear over a distant rise. "Well, boy," Hank said, resting his hand on River's neck, "I guess we've come full circle." The donkey leaned into him, solid and warm and alive. They spent an hour at the camp that day. Hank showed River the shack where Thomas had lived and worked, told him the story even though the donkey couldn't understand the words. It felt important somehow to speak the truth aloud in this place, to honor what had happened here with witness and voice. Before leaving, Hank placed a small marker near the shack, a wooden post with a plaque he'd had made. It read, "Thomas Mercer, 1928 to 1985. He worked this claim with hope for his family's future. May his dedication be remembered and his memory honored." It wasn't enough, could never be enough to make up for 40 years of misunderstanding, but it was something. A start toward rewriting the family narrative with truth instead of bitterness. On the ride back, Hank found himself thinking about beginnings and endings, about how they weren't always as distinct as people liked to believe. The end of his grandfather's life had been the beginning of a mystery that took decades to solve. The end of Hank's isolation had begun with a drowning donkey in a river. Sarah's death had felt like an ending, but maybe it had also been the beginning of whatever he was becoming, now someone who could carry loss without being destroyed by it. That evening, Dutch came by with news. The mining company leasing Thomas's claim had hit a particularly rich vein. The royalty payments to Hank would be significantly larger than initially estimated. "You're going to have real money coming in," Dutch said. "Enough to do something substantial." Hank considered this. "The education fund comes first. But after that," he paused, an idea forming. "You know what this area needs? A rescue operation. For abandoned and injured animals, particularly burros. People dump them, abuse them, and there's nowhere for them to go." Dutch's weathered face broke into a smile. "Sarah would have loved that. She would have, Hank agreed. And I think my grandfather would approve too, turning his work into something that helps creatures who can't help themselves. Over the following months, Hank began laying groundwork for the sanctuary. He cleared and fenced a portion of his property, built additional shelters, and worked with a local veterinarian to establish care protocols. Word spread quickly, and soon people were calling about burrows that needed help, abandoned by owners, injured on BLM land, or simply too old to survive in the wild. River became the unofficial greeter, welcoming each new arrival with gentle nickering and patient presence. He seemed to understand his role, standing calm and steady as frightened or hurting animals were introduced to their new home. The sanctuary filled Hank's days with purpose. The work was hard, feeding, cleaning, veterinary care, repairs to fencing and shelters, but it was the kind of hard that built something instead of just marking time. He hired a part-time helper, a young woman named Elena, who'd grown up on a ranch and understood animals. Dutch volunteered his time, helping with heavy work and using his connections to source supplies at reasonable prices. Other neighbors began stopping by, some to volunteer, others just to see the growing herd of rescued burros. The sanctuary became a community gathering point, a place where people could connect with animals and with each other. Children came for educational visits, learning about burro behavior and desert ecology. Older folks came to simply sit and watch the animals, finding peace in their steady presence. Hank named the operation Thomas's Promise, honoring his grandfather's original intention to build something lasting for future generations. A large wooden sign went up at the property entrance, and Hank felt a sense of completion seeing his grandfather's name displayed with pride, instead of bitterness. A year after pulling River from the Verde River, Hank stood on his porch watching the sun set over his expanded property. 15 burros now called this place home, each with their own story of rescue and recovery. River stood among them, distinguished by the white star on his forehead and his obvious bond with Hank. Dutch walked up from the barn, wiping his hands on his jeans. "That Jenny we brought in last week is doing better. Vet thinks she'll make a full recovery. That's good news," Hank said. "She's been through enough." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the burros settle for the evening. "You did good here," Dutch said, eventually. "Turned tragedy into something meaningful." "Had some help," Hank replied, thinking of the wild herd, of River, of all the strange connections that had led him to this point. "Sarah would be proud. I think so too. I think they both would be, her and my grandfather." As darkness fell, Hank made tour, his rounds, checking water troughs and securing gates. River followed, as he did every evening, patient companion to the end. When the work was done, they stood together, looking out at the desert, at the stars emerging in the darkening sky. Hank thought about the chain of events that had brought him here: a drowning donkey, a mysterious herd, a 40-year-old truth finally revealed, his grandfather's words carved in stone. "Everything I did was for you." He understood now what Thomas had meant. Not just the mining claim and the potential wealth, but the larger lesson about persistence and love and working towards something beyond yourself. About how the things we do echo forward in ways we can't always predict. "You know what I've learned?" Hank asked River, scratching the donkey's favorite spot behind his ears. "That grief doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of something else, something that honors what was lost by building what can be." River leaned into him, solid and warm in the cool evening air. "You taught me that," Hank continued. "You and those wild ones who knew where I needed to go. Funny how animals can see what we miss, how they can lead us back to ourselves when we're lost." A coyote called from somewhere in the hills, and the burros shifted position slightly, aware but not alarmed. This was their home, their safe place. And it was Hank's too. In a way it hadn't been since Sarah died. He was 59 now, no longer young but not done living. The desert stretched out before him in every direction, full of possibility instead of emptiness. He had work that mattered, animals that depended on him, a community that had formed around a shared purpose. He had memories that no longer hurt quite so much of Sarah, of his grandfather, of all the love and loss that had shaped him. And he had River, the half-drowned donkey who'd started it all, standing beside him in the gathering darkness like a promise kept. "Thank you," Hank said quietly. To River, to the wild herd wherever they roamed, to his grandfather and Sarah, and everyone who'd brought him to this moment. "Thank you for showing me the way back." The stars continued their ancient wheel overhead. The desert breathed its evening song. And in a small sanctuary along the Verde River, a man and a donkey stood together, both rescued, both home at last. In the months that followed, Thomas's promised sanctuary continued to grow. News of the operation spread through networks of animal rescuers and burro advocates. Hank found himself part of a larger community dedicated to protecting these often overlooked animals. He attended conferences, shared what he'd learned about burro care and rehabilitation, and connected with others doing similar work across the Southwest. The sanctuary became known for its patient, individualized approach. Unlike larger operations that processed animals quickly, Hank took time with each burro, learning their personality, working through their trauma, preparing them either for adoption or for permanent residence if they were too damaged or old to transition. River remained central to the work. New arrivals seemed to calm in his presence, as if recognizing a fellow survivor. Hank started calling him his lead counselor, only half joking. The donkey had a gift for reading the emotional state of both animals and humans, offering his steady presence when it was needed most. Elena, the young woman Hank had hired, proved invaluable. She brought energy and fresh ideas, helping Hank develop educational programs and social media presence. Under her guidance, the sanctuary's story reached thousands of people online, generating donations and support that allowed the operation to expand further. One afternoon, a woman arrived unannounced, driving a dusty pickup with Utah plates. She was in her 70s, thin and weather-worn, with eyes that held both sorrow and determination. "I'm looking for Hank Mercer," she said when Elena greeted her. "That's me," Hank said, walking over from the barn. "What can I do for you?" The woman studied him for a long moment. "My name is Margaret Cordova. I think I knew your grandfather." Hank felt his pulse quicken. "Thomas Mercer?" "Yes. I worked at the assay office in town back in the 80s. Thomas used to bring in his ore samples. We became friends." She paused. "More than friends, actually." They sat on the porch, and Margaret told her story. She and Thomas had been seeing each other quietly in the months before his death. He'd been planning to file his claim and ask her to marry him. He'd wanted to bring his family together, heal the rift with his son, and start fresh with his strike money as a foundation. "He talked about you constantly," Margaret said, looking at Hank. "He was so proud of you, so full of plans for your future. The mine wasn't about greed or ego. It was about proving himself worthy, about having something real to offer his family." "Why didn't you say something when he disappeared?" Hank asked gently. "I tried. I went to the sheriff, told them Thomas wouldn't just leave." "But your father," she stopped, choosing her words carefully. "Your father made it clear he thought Thomas had run off, and he didn't want me stirring things up. Said his family was done with the old man. I was young, didn't know how to push back against that certainty." Her voice carried old regret. "I should have insisted they search for him. I've carried that guilt for 40 years. Hank reached over and took her hand. "He's been found now, and properly laid to rest. You couldn't have known." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "I heard about your sanctuary, about how you named it after him. That's why I came. I wanted to see what Thomas's grandson had built. I wanted to tell you that your grandfather was a good man who loved his family and deserved to be remembered as such." They talked for hours that afternoon. Margaret shared memories that filled in gaps in Hank's understanding of his grandfather, stories of Thomas's humor, his kindness to others, his dreams for the future. She had a box of letters Thomas had written to her, letters that never made it to the mail because he died before finishing them. Letters that spoke of love and hope and plans for reconciliation. "Would you like these?" Margaret asked, offering the box. They should be with family. Hank accepted the box with gratitude, knowing these letters would become treasured additions to what little remained of Thomas's legacy. Before leaving, Margaret asked to see the burrows. Hank gave her a tour, and she stopped at River's enclosure for a long time. Thomas loved burrows, she said quietly. Said they were noble creatures, survivors who'd been serving humans for thousands of years and deserved better than abandonment. She looked at Hank. He'd be proud of this place. Proud of you. After Margaret left, Hank sat with the box of letters. Reading them felt like meeting his grandfather again, this time without the filter of family bitterness. Thomas emerged as complex and fully human, flawed but trying, proud but capable of tenderness, determined but aware of his mistakes. One letter in particular struck Hank deeply. "My dearest Margaret, I've been thinking about legacy today. Not the kind that comes from gold or silver, though Lord knows I've spent enough time chasing that. I mean the real legacy, the lessons we pass on, the love we show, the example we set. I haven't always done right by my family. Pride and stubbornness have cost me years with my son. But if this claim pays off, I'll have the means to make amends. I'll bring everyone together, show them I'm not just a dreamer chasing fool's gold. I'll be the grandfather Hank deserves, the father my son needed. I'll prove that it's never too late to rebuild what we've broken. That's the real strike, isn't it? Not the silver in the ground, but the connections we forge with each other." Hank set the letter down, emotion thick in his throat. His grandfather had understood what mattered. The mine had just been a means to an end, the end being family, connection, reconciliation. Thomas had run out of time to achieve that goal. But in a strange way, 40 years later, he'd succeeded anyway. The truth of his intentions, finally known, had transformed Hank's understanding of his family history. The money from the claim was building exactly the kind of legacy Thomas had envisioned, and a sanctuary dedicated to helping abandoned creatures carried Thomas's name forward with honor. The old man had managed to reach across 40 years of silence and change the trajectory of his grandson's life. That was legacy indeed. As autumn deepened and the air grew crisp, Hank decided to host a dedication ceremony for the sanctuary. He invited everyone who'd been part of the journey: Dutch, Elena, Margaret, the volunteers, the adopters, the veterinarians, and various community members who'd supported the work. The day of the ceremony was clear and cool, perfect weather. Nearly 50 people gathered at the sanctuary. The burros, accustomed to visitors now, grazed peacefully in the background. River stood near Hank, as always, patient observer to human proceedings. Hank spoke briefly about how the sanctuary had come to exist. He told the story of pulling a dying donkey from a river, of following a wild herd to his grandfather's mine, of discovering truth that transformed bitterness into purpose. He thanked everyone who'd helped build what Thomas's promise had become. "This place exists because of connections," he said, looking out at the gathered crowd. "Connection between a man and a drowning animal, between wild burros and buried truth, between a grandfather's intentions and a grandson's actions, between people who believe that abandoned creatures deserve dignity and care." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My grandfather wrote that. The real legacy isn't gold or silver, but the connections we forge with each other." He was right. This sanctuary is his legacy and my wife Sarah's legacy, and it's a legacy we're all building together every time we rescue an animal, every time we choose compassion over indifference. He unveiled a bronze plaque that would be mounted near the entrance. It read, "Thomas's Promise Sanctuary. Dedicated to Thomas Mercer 1928 to 1985, who worked toward a better future for those he loved. In his memory, we extend that promise to all creatures in need. May we honor him by remembering that it's never too late to build something good from what we've lost." After the ceremony, people lingered, talking and watching the burros, sharing stories of their own connections to animals and loss and healing. Hank found himself surrounded by a community he hadn't known he was building, people brought together by shared purpose and compassion. Margaret approached him as the afternoon wound down. "Thomas would have loved this day," she said. "All these people, all this good work in his name. I wish he could have seen it," Hank replied. "I wish he'd lived to know he mattered, that his work led to something meaningful." "Maybe he does know," Margaret said softly. "I like to think the people we love are still with us somehow, aware of the ripples they've caused. Whether that's true or not, he lives on in what you've built. That's real. That matters." As the sun set and the last visitors departed, Hank walked the property with River, checking on the burros as they settled for the evening. The work never really ended. There would always be more animals in need, more fences to mend, more supplies to secure. But the work gave his life shape and meaning in a way nothing had since Sarah's death. He stopped at the fence line, looking out at the desert. The wild burro herd hadn't returned since that day at his grandfather's camp, but Hank thought about them often, wondered where they were, if they knew somehow that their intervention had led to all of this. "I hope you're out there somewhere, safe and free," he said to the gathering darkness. "I hope you know what you gave me, what you gave all of us who benefit from this place." River nudged his shoulder gently, bringing him back to the present moment. "You're right," Hank said, smiling. "No point in getting too philosophical. Work to do tomorrow, same as always." They walked back to the barn together, man and donkey, both exactly where they were meant to be. That night, Hank opened Sarah's journal one last time. He'd filled many pages since that first entry about finding truth and grace. Now he wrote a final entry. "A year has passed since River came into my life. What started as a simple act of mercy, pulling a drowning animal from a river, became the catalyst for everything that followed. Finding grandfather's truth, starting the sanctuary, building community. Learning that loss doesn't have to be the put. End of the story. I understand now what you always knew, Sarah, that paying attention to animals, to nature, to the small moments of grace that present themselves, that's where real wisdom lives. Not in books or theories, but in the patient presence of a donkey, the mysterious knowing of a wild herd, the connections we make when we choose compassion over isolation. Thomas's promise is more than a sanctuary for burros. It's a promise that despite loss and tragedy and the long years of misunderstanding, something good can still be built. That it's never too late to honor those we've lost by living with purpose and openness. I miss you every day, but I'm grateful now, instead of just empty. Grateful for the years we had, grateful for what you taught me about seeing clearly, grateful that your love shaped me in ways that made this work possible. River saved my life the day I pulled him from that river. Not despite needing rescue himself, but because of it. We saved each other, maybe. That's the real lesson, that redemption is never a solo journey. We pull each other from drowning, lead each other to truth, remind each other what matters. Thank you for everything, my love. I'll keep building something worthy of you and of grandfather and of all the lost creatures who find their way to this place. That's my promise, and I'll keep it as long as I live." He closed the journal gently and placed it on the shelf where it had lived for years. Some chapters close, he thought, others begin. The trick is recognizing which is which and having the courage to turn the page. Outside, the desert night was alive with its ancient rhythms. Inside, Hank Mercer slept peacefully, dreaming of rivers and wild herds, and all the unexpected ways grace enters a life when we're willing to answer its call. In the years that followed, Thomas's promised sanctuary became a fixture in the regional landscape of animal rescue. The operation grew steadily but sustainably, never expanding beyond Hank's ability to maintain the personal, attentive care that defined the place. At its peak, the sanctuary housed 23 burros, each known by name, each with their own story of survival and recovery. Hank aged into the work, his body adjusting to the physical demands, even as his hair went fully white and his face lined deeper. He was in his early 60s now, fit and purposeful in ways he'd never been during his years of isolation. The work kept him young, he liked to say, or at least kept him moving. Elena had become his partner in running the operation, taking on more responsibility as Hank focused on the aspects he loved most: direct animal care and community education. They made a good team, her energy and technical skills complementing his experience and intuition. River remained the heart of the sanctuary. The grey donkey, now in his teens, had grown distinguished and serene. He still greeted every new arrival with gentle patience, still shadowed Hank through daily rounds, still served as the living reminder of where it had all begun. Visitors to the sanctuary always wanted to hear River's story, and Hank never tired of telling it. Each retelling refined the narrative, distilling it down to essential truth. Sometimes saving one life opens the door to saving your own. On a spring morning, 3 years after the sanctuary's dedication, Hank was working in the barn when he heard an unusual sound, the collective braying of every burro on the property, all at once. It wasn't alarm, exactly, but definitely communication. Something had gotten their attention. He stepped outside and stopped, his breath catching. The wild herd stood at the property's edge. 7 burros in their familiar formation, the grey jack with the white blaze at the front. They'd been gone for years, not seen since that day at Thomas's camp. Now they were back. Hank walked slowly toward them, his heart pounding. As he approached, the sanctuary burros gathered behind him, forming a loose group. River pushed forward to stand at Hank's shoulder. The grey jack stepped closer, closing the distance until only a few feet separated them. The animal looked older, his muzzle greyer, but his eyes held the same knowing intelligence Hank remembered. For a long moment, man and wild donkey regarded each other. Then the jack did something unexpected. He turned and walked toward the sanctuary's main pasture, stopping at the fence line. He stood there, waiting, while the 6 other members of his herd moved to stand beside him. "What are you telling me?" Hank asked softly. The answer became clear as he watched. The wild burros were old. Not just aged, but elderly in a way that made Hank's heart ache with recognition. Their coats were rough, their movements stiff. These weren't the strong, mysterious guides who'd led him into the desert years ago. They were tired animals, nearing the end of their lives, and they'd come home. Home, that's what they'd made of his place. Or maybe what they'd known it would become. Hank opened the gate. One by one, the wild herd walked through, entering the sanctuary with a dignity that suggested they'd always known they'd be welcomed here. They moved among the domestic burros with familiarity, as if rejoining a group they'd always been part of. The grey jack stopped in front of River. The 2 donkeys touched noses, a greeting between old friends or perhaps brothers in purpose. Then the jack moved to Hank, lowered his great head, and for the first time allowed himself to be touched. Hank placed his hand on the burro's neck, feeling the warmth and life still present despite the animal's age. "You can stay," he said, his voice thick. "As long as you need. This is your home too." The integration was seamless, almost as if it had been predestined. The wild burros accepted care and handling with minimal resistance, as if they'd decided to trade their freedom for comfort in their final years. Within days, they were eating from Hank's hand, allowing Elena to trim their hooves, settling into the rhythm of sanctuary life. Dutch, visiting that week, watched the enlarged herd with satisfaction. "They knew," he said, "just like they knew to lead you to your grandfather. They knew this place would be here when they needed it." "I owe them everything," Hank said. "Without them, none of this exists." "Maybe," Dutch replied. "Or maybe it works both ways. They needed you to build this, so they'd have somewhere to go when the time came. Maybe you've all been taking care of each other from the start." It was a comforting thought, the idea of reciprocal care extending across years and species boundaries. Hank chose to believe it. The wild burros lived out their remaining years in peace and comfort. One by one, they passed first a Jenny in her sleep, then another Jack from old age, then others in their time. Hank buried each one with respect, marking their graves with simple stones carved with the Dates, they'd arrived and departed. The Grey Jack lived longest, making it 3 full years at the sanctuary before his body finally gave out. He died on a cool autumn morning with River standing vigil beside him, both donkeys at peace with the transition. Hank dug the grave himself, wanting the physical work as a way to process grief. He buried the Grey Jack on a rise overlooking the property, where the view stretched to the distant hills where Thomas's old camp still stood. At the gravesite, Hank spoke words he'd prepared. "You were a mystery and a teacher. You led me to truth when I was drowning in bitterness. You showed me that some things can't be explained, only experienced. Thank you for trusting us with your final years. Thank you for making this place possible. Rest well." He marked the grave with a larger stone than the others, and Elena helped him mount a bronze plaque. The Grey Guide. He knew the way when others were lost. May we honor him by continuing to offer sanctuary to those who need it. River stood by the grave for 3 days afterward, leaving only to eat and drink before returning. Hank understood the grief he felt it too. The Grey Jack had been more than a wild animal. He'd been a catalyst, a guide, a mysterious force that had entered Hank's life at exactly the right moment and changed everything. On the 4th day, River finally left the gravesite and returned to his normal routine. He seemed older somehow, more contemplative, but still present and engaged. Life continued, as it always did, even in the face of loss. That winter was mild, allowing the sanctuary's work to continue without interruption. Hank found himself thinking often about cycles, how things came around again, how endings led to beginnings, how loss and gain were woven together in ways that made them inseparable. His grandfather had lost his life trying to gain something for his family. That loss, finally discovered, had gained Hank a purpose he'd been missing. The wild burros had lost their leader but gained a peaceful end. River had lost his herd but gained a home. Hank had lost Sarah and his illusions about his grandfather, but gained clarity and community. Nothing was ever just lost or just gained. Everything transformed into something else if you gave it time and attention. As spring arrived and the desert bloomed with unusual abundance after winter rains, Hank celebrated his 63rd birthday quietly. Elena organized a small gathering at the Sanctuary Dutch. Some volunteers, a few regular visitors who'd become friends. They ate cake and told stories, and Hank felt the warmth of community that had been missing from so much of his life. River, now entering his late teens, stood near the group, still alert and present. Someone asked Hank what the donkey's age might be, and he realized with a start that he'd never actually known. River had appeared fully grown that day in the river, his history unknown. He might be 18, might be 20, might be older. Burros could live into their 30s with good care, but they could also decline suddenly. The thought of losing River struck Hank with unexpected force. This donkey had been his companion through transformation, his constant presence through the rebuilding of his life. Losing him would be like losing a piece of himself. But that was the price of love, wasn't it? The willingness to hurt later for the sake of connection now. Sarah had taught him that. His grandfather had taught him that. Even the wild burros had taught him that living free and wild until age forced them to seek shelter, trading their legendary independence for care at the end. Love meant vulnerability. It meant opening yourself to loss. But the alternative, isolation and self-protection, was a kind of death in itself. Better to love and lose than to never risk love at all. Hank scratched River's ears, and the donkey leaned into him with familiar trust. "We'll have as long as we have," he told the animal. "However long that is, it'll have been worth it." As the party wound down and people began leaving, Dutch lingered. He'd grown frailer in recent years, moving slower, taking longer to catch his breath. At 77, he was still sharp and engaged, but his body was clearly wearing down. "Been thinking about my place," Dutch said as they stood watching the sunset. "The ranch. I don't have kids to leave it to, and my nephews aren't interested. Was thinking," he paused, "was thinking Maybe it could expand your operation here. More space for rescues, room to grow. Hank looked at him. Dutch, that's... Don't answer now. Just think about it. When I'm gone, that land should go to something worthwhile. This sanctuary is worthwhile. Thomas would approve. He smiled. Hell, I approve. They stood in comfortable silence, two old men watching the day end, both aware of their own mortality, both at peace with what they'd built and preserved. I'll think about it, Hank said finally, and Dutch, thank you. For everything, for showing up after Sarah died, for helping find my grandfather, for all of it. That's what neighbors do, Dutch replied simply. Take care of each other, take care of the land, take care of the creatures that can't care for themselves. Your grandfather knew that. You know it too. That's legacy enough for any life. The seasons continued their cycle. Summer heat, autumn cool, winter cold, spring renewal. The sanctuary endured and grew, not in size but in impact. Word of its work spread and donations increased, allowing Hank to hire additional help and improve facilities. More rescued burros arrived. Some from Bureau of Land Management roundups, others from private owners who could no longer care for them, still others found abandoned on roadsides or neglected on properties where they'd been forgotten. Each arrival brought their own story of suffering or neglect, and each found healing at Thomas's promise. The work was never finished, never perfect, but it was deeply meaningful. Hank went to bed tired most nights, but it was the good kind of tired. The exhaustion that came from useful labor, from making a difference, from living with purpose. River continued as the sanctuary's heart and ambassador. Even as he aged, he maintained his gentle nature and his uncanny ability to calm frightened or traumatized animals. Visitors still marveled at him, still asked to hear his story, still seemed to understand that this particular donkey was special in ways that transcended the ordinary. On a morning in late May, nearly 5 years after pulling River from the Verde River, Hank woke to find the donkey standing by his bedroom window, visible in the pre-dawn light. This was unusual. River typically stayed in the barn until Hank came out for morning chores. He dressed quickly and went outside. River turned when he approached, and in that moment, Hank understood. The donkey's eyes held something final, a clarity that spoke of endings and acceptance. Not yet, Hank said softly, reaching out to touch River's face. Please, not yet. But even as he said it, he knew. Animals understood their own time in ways humans often didn't. River had come to say goodbye. They walked together one last time, making a slow circuit of the sanctuary as the sun rose. River stopped at each pasture, each shelter, as if acknowledging the life they'd built together. The other burros seemed to understand what was happening, gathering along the fence lines to watch. Finally, they reached the rise where the grey Jack was buried. River walked to the grave and stood there, looking out at the desert hills in the distance. Hank stood beside him, his hand on the donkey's neck, both of them silent. "You saved me," Hank said, his voice breaking. "I pulled you out of that river, but you're the one who saved me. From drowning in grief and bitterness and loneliness, you gave me back my life." River leaned against him, solid and warm and alive. "Thank you," Hank continued, "for everything, for leading me to the truth, for standing with me through all of it, for being the best companion I could have asked for." They stood there as the sun climbed higher, man and donkey together one final time, surrounded by the sanctuary they'd built, overlooking the desert that had witnessed their journey. When River finally lay down, it was gentle, peaceful. Hank sat beside him, keeping vigil, as the donkey's breathing slowed. He talked quietly, reminding River of the good things they'd experienced, the lives they'd touched, the legacy they'd created. "Rest now," Hank whispered. "You've earned it. Give Sarah my love when you see her. Tell my grandfather the work continues. Tell that grey Jack we're still here, still offering sanctuary." River's last breath came as the sun reached its zenith, flooding the desert with light. His passing was so quiet, so peaceful, that Hank almost didn't notice the exact moment. One breath, then stillness, then only the wind and the distant calls of other burros. Hank sat with the body for a long time, crying freely, grieving the loss while simultaneously feeling gratitude for having known this remarkable animal. River had been a gift, unexpected, transformative, irreplaceable. Elena found him there an hour later. She didn't speak, just sat down on his other side, offering her presence. Eventually, Dutch arrived, having somehow known he was needed. Other volunteers appeared, drawn by the same mysterious communication that seemed to flow through the sanctuary. They buried River beside the grey Jack, in the place of honor overlooking the property. Hank carved the stone himself, working through the afternoon to shape the words, River, rescued, and rescuer. He showed the way to healing. His memory lives in every creature saved at Thomas's promise. The funeral, held the next day, drew a surprising crowd. Over 100 people came: adopters, volunteers, donors, community members, people who'd visited once and been touched by River's story. They stood together as Hank spoke about what the donkey had meant, how one life could ripple outward to touch hundreds of others. River taught me that grace often comes in unexpected forms, Hank said, that sometimes we save ourselves by saving others. That loyalty and compassion aren't exclusively human qualities, they exist in all creatures, if we're willing to see them. He paused, looking out at the gathered crowd. This sanctuary continues because of him. Every animal we rescue in his name and in the name of the wild burros who led us to truth. The work goes on. That's how we honor him. After everyone left, Hank stood alone at the gravesite. 2 graves, now the grey Jack and River, guides both, resting side by side, overlooking the desert they'd known so well. Thank you for bringing me here, he said to them both. Thank you for showing me the night. Way back to living. I'll keep the promise. As long as I'm able, this place will remain a sanctuary. The days after River's death were difficult. Hank moved through his routines mechanically at first, the absence of his constant companion, a wound that wouldn't quickly heal. But gradually, as had happened after Sarah's death, the acute pain softened into something more bearable. A permanent sadness, yes, but one that coexisted with gratitude and purpose. The sanctuary had 21 burros now, all depending on him, all deserving the same care and attention River had helped him learn to give. He couldn't stop, couldn't retreat into grief. The work called him forward, day after day, and he answered that call. Elena proved invaluable during this time, taking on additional responsibilities and helping Hank process his loss through continued engagement with the animals. They spent long evenings talking about River, sharing memories, keeping his story alive. He'll live on in the port. Sanctuary, Elena said one night. Every burro we save, that's River's legacy. Every person who visits and learns to see these animals differently, that's him too. I know, Hank replied. It helps, knowing that. But God, I miss him. Of course you do. He was family. Yes, that's what River had been. Not just a rescued animal or a working companion, but family in the truest sense. Someone who stood with you through everything, who knew you completely, who loved without condition. Hank had lost a lot of family over the years. His grandfather, his father, his mother, Sarah, now River. But he'd also gained family in unexpected ways. Elena had become like a daughter. Dutch was like a brother. The volunteers and regular visitors formed an extended family, bound by shared purpose. Even the burros themselves were family of a sort, each one mattering individually. Loss and gain, woven together, impossible to separate. As summer arrived, Hank received word that Dutch had passed away in his sleep. The old rancher had lived a full life and died peacefully, which was the best anyone could hope for. But it still hurt. Another connection severed, another friend gone. Dutch's will included the promised bequest. His ranch property would be transferred to Thomas's promised sanctuary, expanding Hank's operation by over 100 acres. It came with one condition, that a portion of the land remain undeveloped, preserved as habitat for wild burros and other desert wildlife. Hank honored that condition gladly. Dutch had understood that true sanctuary meant more than just rescuing domestic animals. It meant protecting the wild ones too, preserving their space and freedom even as the human world continued to encroach. The expanded sanctuary meant new possibilities. Hank and Elena developed plans for a visitor center where school groups could learn about burro behavior and desert ecology. They created larger pastures where the rescued animals could roam more freely. They set aside trails where volunteers could hike and observe wildlife without disturbing it. Thomas's promise was evolving from a simple rescue operation into something larger, a community resource, an educational center, a testament to what could be built when people chose compassion over indifference. On the one-year anniversary of River's death, Hank organized a memorial event. People gathered at the sanctuary to remember not just River, but all the animals and people who'd shaped the place into what it had become. Stories were shared, tears were shed, laughter rang out as memories surfaced. Hank spoke last, standing near River's grave. "A year ago, I lost my best friend. I've lost a lot of friends over the years, and each loss teaches the same lesson, that love is worth the pain of loss, that connection is worth the risk of separation, that the time we have together, however brief, is precious beyond measure." He looked out at the crowd, at the familiar and new faces, at the sanctuary spread out below. "River brought me here to this place, to this work, to all of you. His life touched hundreds of others, and through those people, thousands more. That's the real miracle. Not that one donkey survived, but that his survival led to so much else." He paused, emotion rising. "I miss him every day. I miss the grey Jack who led me to my grandfather's truth. I miss Dutch, who showed me what it means to be a good neighbor. I miss Sarah, who taught me to see beauty in ordinary things. I miss my grandfather, who I never got to know as an adult, but whose legacy I carry forward." His voice strengthened. "But I'm not defined by loss. None of us are. We're defined by how we respond to loss, whether we let it close us down or whether we let it open us up to deeper understanding of what matters. This sanctuary is my response. Your presence here is your response. Together we're saying that love and loss go hand in hand, and we choose love anyway." The crowd was silent, moved by the simple truth of his words. "Thank you all for being part of this," Hank concluded, "for helping build something that honors everyone we've lost by caring for those who remain. River would be proud. They all would be proud." As people dispersed afterward, wandering among the pastures and sitting in quiet reflection, Hank remained at the gravesite. A young Jenny, one of the recent rescues, approached tentatively. She'd been severely neglected when she arrived 3 months ago, fearful of human contact, traumatized by mistreatment. Now she walked up to Hank and lowered her head, asking to be touched. He obliged, scratching her ears gently. She leaned into his hand, trusting, peaceful. This, Hank thought, this is why we continue. For moments like this, when a damaged creature learns to trust again, when fear transforms into confidence, when the capacity for connection survives despite every reason to retreat. "You're safe now," he told the Jenny. "This is your home for as long as you need it." She stayed beside him for several minutes, both of them looking out at the desert hills where River and the Grey Jack had once led Hank toward truth and healing. The sun was setting, painting the landscape in shades of gold and crimson. New rescues would arrive tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The work would continue, seasons would turn, years would pass. Hank would age further, eventually need to plan for succession, ensure that Thomas's promise outlived him. But tonight, in this moment, he simply stood with a rescued Jenny beside 2 graves on a hilltop, surrounded by the sanctuary he'd built from grief and grace, and felt something like peace settle into his bones. The story that had begun with a drowning donkey in a river had become something larger than he could have imagined, a legacy of compassion, a community of care, a living testament to the power of connection across species and time and circumstance. River had saved him. He'd saved River, and together they'd saved countless others. That was enough. That was everything. As darkness fell and stars began emerging in the vast desert sky, Hank made his way back to the cabin, the Jenny following at a comfortable distance. Tomorrow would bring its challenges and rewards, its moments of loss and grace, its opportunities to choose connection over isolation. He was ready for it. River had taught him how to be ready, one breath, one day, one act of mercy at a time. The desert night breathed around him, ancient and knowing. Somewhere in those hills, wild burros roamed free, living their mysterious lives. And here, in this sanctuary, rescued burros found safety and healing, their stories woven together into something larger than any individual life. Hank thought about the chain of connections that had brought him to this moment. A grandfather who died trying to provide for his family, a wife who taught him to see beauty in ordinary things, a herd of wild burros who'd known the way when he was lost, and a half-drowned donkey who'd needed rescue and ended up being the rescuer. All of it connected, all of it meaningful. All of it part of a larger story about what it means to live with open hands and an open heart, to risk love despite loss, to build something good from the broken pieces of what came before. "Thank you," Hank said to the night, "to everyone who'd brought him here, to all the creatures who'd trusted him with their care. Thank you for showing me the way home." And in the stillness of the desert darkness, surrounded by the quiet breathing of the animals he'd devoted his life to protecting, Hank Mercer finally understood what his grandfather had tried to tell him across 40 years of silence. Legacy isn't what we leave behind. It's what we build from what we've been given, transforming loss into love, turning pain into purpose, making sure that every ending becomes someone else's beginning. That was Thomas's promise. That was River's gift. And that was Hank's life's work, keeping the promise, honoring the gift, ensuring that the sanctuary would stand as long as there were creatures who needed refuge and people who believed that compassion could change the world, one rescued life at a time. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the burrows settled into sleep, and the sanctuary that had been built from grace and grief and the mysterious knowing of wild things stood ready to welcome whatever came next, a beacon of hope in the vast desert.